We're live.
Is it working? It's a miracle. A Christmas miracle.
Yay.
It's a miracle. Okay.
We're tech illiterate, apparently.
I have an excuse, which is that I am boomer adjacent. I don't know. Molly's.
I'm a zillennial, so I have a little bit of
Molly's
boomer in
working on
me, a little bit.
Sorry about that. Sorry, everyone. We're a little tardy, but I think it's working now.
Mhm.
I can see Adam Bailey in the chat. Looks like.
Get your red yarn ready.
Yeah. True story. I was going to go to Michael's to get more red yarn for today, but Michael's is owned by a private equity company called Apollo Global Management.
What isn't?
So we have to boycott them. All right, we'll get into that. Do you want to do a little intro?
So yeah, this is our first ever YouTube Live.
As you can tell.
As you can very much tell, we're coming to you live from the downtown east side in Vancouver, BC, Canada, from the unceded territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Squamish. Unceded meaning they've never relinquished their rights to their land and title, and they should still have decision-making power over that land. And we're launching the No Billions for Slisms campaign today. We're launching a month of action, essentially. That's going to culminate in a week of in-person actions. But until that, you can join our digital action squad to receive weekly missions targeting key ministers. That will be on the Slisms decision. And speaking of Slisms,
what's your name?
My name is Molly. I am the video and communications coordinator at Dogwood. I make most of the social media content.
You know Molly. You know Molly. If you're on this channel, you know Molly. I'm Kai. I'm the other talking head who pops up once in a while. I am the energy campaigner at Dogwood.
Great.
Yeah.
And now that you know our names, what is Slisms, Kai?
Okay. Very briefly, this is a proposed 100% American-owned gas terminal in northern BC that would be built at a shipyard in Korea and floated over here and hooked up to the PRGT pipeline, the Prince Rupert Gas Transmission Pipeline. And right now, those guys are trying as hard as they can to get financing for the project to start construction. And that means huge loans from the federal government. So we'll get into that a little bit later on. But yeah, it's backed by these horrible private equity billionaires from New York. And we'll talk about all those connections and what else they're up to around the world.
You can see some of them behind us. It's
Yes.
a totally unproblematic project backed by really lovely men.
Yeah, great guys.
So yeah, let's get right into it. Kai, we're currently witnessing a rapid expansion of the war in the Middle East. The Strait of Hormuz off Iran's southern coast is the world's most important oil choke point. It sees 20% of global oil and LNG capacity go through it every single day, and it's basically disabled at the moment. We're also seeing bombing campaigns across the region, targeting oil reserves, military bases. We saw a recent US-Israeli strike on a girls' school in Iran that killed 175 people, mainly children. And one day after that strike, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith said to media that now is the perfect time, given the war in Iran, to build a new oil export pipeline from Alberta. So Kai, why are Canadian oil and gas guys so stoked on the idea of expanding war in the Middle East?
Right. So the short answer is short-term profit, right? They see number go up on the graph and everyone says, if we had more pipelines, more export capacity, we would be the ones cashing in on this war. So, if you drive a gas car, if you've been by a gas station in the last week, you've seen that everybody has jacked up their prices. So anybody who is on the selling side of oil or gas in the world right now is making money hand over fist. And this is the same thing that we saw in the Russian invasion of Ukraine. When these big, unpredictable events happen, the market tends to react with fear, and so prices for barrels of oil go up and prices at the pump go up. And so, yeah, it's ordinary people who are paying more. This is especially true for LNG, right? LNG is used for power generation in lots of countries around the world, and Qatar is the number 2 biggest producer of LNG in the world. And basically, all of their gas is processed at this huge industrial complex right on the Persian Gulf, directly in the line of fire from Iranian missiles and drones. They've been hit twice. They've shut down production entirely. And so that means no Qatari gas. That's 20% of the world's supply that is offline for the foreseeable future. And so suddenly that means that anyone else who can get gas to customers, those cargoes are worth double. And who are the biggest gas producers in the world? I mean, Russia is obviously cashing in right now, but the United States is number one. So the US started this war, and it's US companies that are benefiting so far from those price spikes on LNG.
Yeah. And this is a good moment to bring up a question we received from Rowena, shout out Rowena, who asked, what happens when this US gas floods the market?
Right. So just one technical note, a lot of US gas contracts allow the buyer to resell that gas to other countries. And so they're called flexible cargoes. And that means it's a very attractive thing right now because power stations, importers all over the world are looking for those available cargoes, and they're willing to pay almost double what they were 2 weeks ago. And so there's a ton of gas from those terminals in Louisiana and Texas that is suddenly effectively worth twice as much as it was before the war started. And so here in Canada, we also are an LNG exporter now. We have one sort of semi-functional terminal in Kitimat, and our Minister for Energy, Tim Hodgson, is super excited about expanding that. Even before the war, he was talking about building as many terminals as the US has now. And he says, basically, now is the time. Other countries want our supply. And so we're going to be the ones to build more oil and gas terminals and, supply all those markets. The obvious problem with this is that this volatility and these high prices destroy demand long term. So 4 years ago, you saw people in Europe starting to switch to heat pumps after Russia invaded Ukraine. We're now even further along on the sort of technological curve. Solar is even cheaper. And if you're like a rational country that is looking for ways to generate electricity that is cheaper than gas, doesn't produce any emissions, and isn't subject to these wild price fluctuations created by wars that you can't control, renewable energy makes way more sense. And so that's why you're seeing countries like South Korea this week saying, forget it. We need to get off LNG as quickly as we can, and we need to start building out renewable capacity in a serious way. And so I think that's what we're going to see in developing countries all around the world. And these are supposed to be the customers for all those gas terminals that Canada wants to build that would take 4 or 5 years to get across the line. And that demand, it's very uncertain after this war whether that will ever return.
Mm-hmm. Which is not what Canada Action will have you think. The world needs Canadian LNG.
According to the bus ads. And I mean, if you can't believe things that are printed on the side of a bus, what can you believe?
What can you believe? Yeah, it definitely doesn't seem like doubling down on a fuel that's more volatile than the whims of Donald Trump is exactly the key to long-term security and prosperity. So it seems that shocks and crises like the war in Iran and even genocides are always weaponized by powerful people to consolidate even more power and wealth. We all watched with horror as Trump unveiled his plan for Gaza in Davos in January, which is essentially to sell Gaza off for parts to Trump-friendly investors and turn it into a nightmarish panopticon controlled by Israel and the US. So you've been kind of digging into this, and you've found a link between the US plan for Gaza and the LNG industry here in BC. Could you untangle some of those threads?
Yeah, so there's a couple of links, but the key guy is actually on the screen behind us here. It's Mark Rowan. So he is the CEO of a firm called Apollo Global Management. This is a big Wall Street private equity firm. And Mark Rowan is also on the Board of Peace, which is that new international body of like despots and oligarchs created by Donald Trump. And he's on the Gaza Executive Board, responsible for essentially the real estate side of this Gaza redevelopment plan. And so at that Board of Peace meeting in Washington last month, Rowan was gushing about how he hopes to unlock at least $115 billion in value from redeveloping the real estate in the Gaza Strip. And so they're talking about like the Riviera, like a waterfront sort of mega city, much like Dubai, which is currently being hammered by Iranian missiles. They want to create this like playground seaside city for the ultra rich. But inland, starting in Rafah, what Mark Rowan is describing is essentially a series of high-tech internment camps for the Palestinian population, built by American private capital and the Israeli military. Biometric security, drones hovering overhead, like the full, you said panopticon, same. It's the full 9 yards, and yeah, this this whole scheme is being advised by a guy who our viewers might be familiar with, former U.S. general, former CIA director, David Petraeus. So he is also, right in there, helping to shape this future of the Middle East, alongside these other private equity billionaires. And David Petraeus now works in the private sector on Wall Street. He's the head of intelligence, and he's a partner at a firm called KKR. And KKR manages a controlling share of the Coastal GasLink pipeline, which is Canada's only gas pipeline to the coast. And Mark Rowan, sorry, this is the punchline, he is one of the major investors in the Ksi Lisims gas terminal that we talked about at the beginning. So Apollo Global Management was the first major firm to invest in this project. They funded its development. We don't know the exact size of their equity stake, but it's worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And so you have KKR and Apollo Global Management, which would be in control of the only two major pipelines from Northeast BC to the coast. And so I think that's worth taking a closer look at. And it's literally the same guys who are enacting U.S. foreign policy right now in Gaza. And of course, no surprise, all of these guys are also in the Epstein files. That's why we have the graphic. Mark Rowan took over as CEO at Apollo because his co-founder had to step down because of his ties to Jeffrey Epstein. Rowan was also going to Epstein's townhouse. He was also seeking financial advice for his personal investments and for Apollo. And so all of these guys that are in the Epstein files, that are key to funding the Trump project, key to enacting his foreign policy abroad, and who are betting in a big way on LNG expansion in BC, it's literally all the same people.
Yeah. And as someone who lives in BC, it doesn't feel great knowing that the billionaire creeps advising the unhinged despot who's been threatening to annex us for more than a year have been buying up strategic energy assets in Canada for years. I think they first invested in 2018 in Slisms. So, how exactly does BC and Canada figure into the Trump administration's global energy policy?
Right. So we talked about Mark Rowan, Leon Black, and Apollo Global Management. We talked about David Petraeus, the former general, and KKR. There's also Blackstone, which is run by Steve Schwartzman, the so-called king of Wall Street. He was one of the top 10 donors to Trump in the last election cycle and remains a key advisor, specifically on the Middle East. And so all of these guys are invested in this speculative gas project on the West Coast, and in Coastal GasLink, but there's a much older history, right? The U.S. capital is likely the majority of investment in oil and gas in Canada, and they're our biggest customer. I mean, essentially, you could flip that around and say Canada is like a huge fuel depot for the U.S. empire, for the U.S. economy. And so, when we talk about the oil and gas industry, I don't think it's actually super useful to distinguish between the Canadian and American oil and gas industry. It's one integrated industry. The pipelines go back and forth across the border. The capital in order to build a lot of these upstream projects, both in the oil sands and the fracking, that's American. We really are part of that same project and part of that same vision. And so, oil has a limited runway as a motor fuel. You can see China producing all these electric cars, and really the demand for petroleum is starting to level off. But gas is another story. And so they have a strategy around gas. As I mentioned, the US is the world's largest LNG exporter, largest gas producer. And what they're really trying to do is lock in these new customers. By flooding the market with new gas, you bring the prices down enough that you can get countries like India, Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam, right? Like developing countries that are looking for new reliable sources of electricity. They're really trying to get them locked into burning gas. And then they can milk those customers for the next 30 or 40 years. And so really, this is all about fighting the rise of renewables. It's about keeping people hooked on fossil fuels and expanding and entrenching that American control over energy markets worldwide.
Yeah. And threatening them with crippling tariffs if they refuse.
Totally. They have all these coercive measures at their disposal. And of course, they can always park an aircraft carrier off your coast or drop bombs or kidnap your president or whatever, right? They're really flexing that hard power. And so, Canada, I think we just need to acknowledge that we are part of that. We are attached to the US. They call this Greater North America. They talk about the American continent. They don't obviously respect our sovereignty. They don't care about the fake line on the map that Donald Trump talked about. They see it all as part of the US project. And I think the choice for us as a country, as a jurisdiction, is whether we want to more deeply integrate with this US fossil fuel and war machine, or whether we want to start to try to get out of some of that control of American billionaires and start to forge our own energy future.
I feel like it's the difference between words and practice. Like, now is the perfect time to do that. And we're hearing some nice words about doing that from Carney at Davos, for instance. But in practice, when it really matters, when there's a terminal backed by mega, like being proposed in our own backyards, they are happy to greenlight that. Premier David Eby, when he approved Ksi Lisims back into September, went so far as to say that he welcomes any investment in the province, regardless of where it comes from. He was referring specifically to the mega investors behind this project. And Mark Carney has prioritized Ksi Lisims as a nation-building project. So, Kai, on the political Canadian landscape, where are things at with Ksi Lisims LNG right now?
Right. So we talked about the Wall Street investors, we talked about the American ownership, and none of that so far has phased David Eby or Mark Carney. And so both of these governments are enthusiastically supporting this American project. And so that means like not just granting them all of their permits and sort of like fast tracking stuff on the regulatory side, they're considering massive government subsidies. So let's rewind a little bit, and we'll just acknowledge that like 2 weeks ago, before the bombs started falling in Iran, the world was entering a global LNG glut, oversupply, too many new terminals, not enough new customers. And so that was actually pushing prices down, especially in Asia. And that created a big problem for Ksi Lisims, because at the end of the day, no matter how much political support there is, all of these projects need customers, and they need firm customers. They need contracts signed over multiple decades that lock in that steady revenue so that they can go to the banks and get the loans to build for construction. So they have all of their permits. They have all of this supportive rhetoric and new legislation, and the RCMP on standby, and like the Canadian government is ready to throw whatever it can into promoting this project, but they still need to lock in those firm customers for the gas. And before this war started, they were at like 1/3 of the terminal's capacity, and they need at least like 3/4. The banks want to see that you've got a steady long-term customer base. So now what the argument is, it's not that we're the cheapest supplier. It's not that we're the most ethical or the greenest supplier. The argument is we are a stable and secure supplier of gas. And that is because we are on the North American continent. Unlike the Qataris, who produce 20% of the world's LNG, they're getting hit by Iranian missiles right now. The bet is nobody is going to have the guts to try to hit an LNG terminal in North America. We are under the NORAD missile shield. We are part of that American oil and gas empire. And so now those American companies that have operations in Canada are really pushing this idea that we are a secure and stable supplier of the products that you are addicted to, that you need for your economy to run all around the world. And so it's not overt coercion. It's just saying, hey, lovely neighborhood, would be a shame if anything were to happen to it. We're the guys that can make sure that you have that steady supply of gas that you need in order to keep the lights on. And so that's, I think, really the argument, is that we're inside the fortress. So that's the sort of that's the pitch to customers. But the truth is the economics on these projects are still super marginal. And that is because they're just super expensive to build. They're super expensive to build. And as we've seen, long-term demand is kind of shaky and the prices go up and down. And so the long story short is that they need government money. They really want huge subsidies from the Canadian taxpayers in order to de-risk these projects. And so, yeah, there's basically two mechanisms that they're pursuing. One is like a big fat taxpayer loan from the Canada Infrastructure Bank. So that's overseen by Minister Gregor Robertson. And that would really signal to private lenders like the big American banks, the Canadian banks, that this is like low risk, this is a sure bet because it's backed by the Canadian government. And number two is that they really want First Nations to take on the risk of building the pipeline, not the terminal. And I think there's an important distinction, which is that the terminal is 100% American owned. It would be built overseas. It could be floated over. And it should be said that if the markets were to change, or if that pipeline couldn't be built, that's a floating asset. They could just move that somewhere else in the world. But the pipeline is risky for a couple of reasons. One is the geography, labor costs, steel costs, but also all of these lawsuits from First Nations who oppose the project. There's 5 different Indigenous groups that are suing Ksi Lisims and PRGT. We've already seen blockades on the PRGT route, and there's House groups and First Nations that are saying absolutely not, and even filing title claims to land onto the pipeline route. So it's legally and materially extremely risky. And so what they're trying to do is get First Nations to take on like equity stakes, to buy in with borrowed money in order to take on some of that risk of building the pipeline. And they need the federal government to backstop all of those loans, because we're talking about very small band councils borrowing hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. And the only way for the banks to go for that is with that taxpayer backing. So this is really the name of the game now, is to try to use government support, taxpayer backing, in order to de-risk these projects. And that's really our biggest lever, I think, as Canadians and for First Nations, is really to go after the money, and specifically to go after the ministers, the politicians who are considering bankrolling these projects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I want to talk about the ownership of SLISMs for a second, because you hear in mainstream media all the time, oh, it's Indigenous owned, it's Indigenous owned, all the profits will flow to the Nisga'a Lisims government. But it's more complicated than that. And yeah, could you unpack that a little for the viewers?
Yeah, it's actually super simple. It's 100% owned by a company in Texas called Western LNG, which has no other projects. It is backstopped entirely. All of its funding comes from these Wall Street private equity firms, and that would be the sole owner. They would pay essentially rent to the Nisga'a government to park the terminal off the mouth of the Nass River, and the pipeline would cross Nisga'a territory, as well as many other First Nations, and those are the nations that Western is trying to get to buy equity stakes. But yeah, the terminal itself and all of the profits that come from it would be American owned. And the terminal is really, like, if you think of it like a factory, that's really where it adds value to the product. Like, the gas is worth almost nothing here in BC, like pennies, right? But when you can turn it into a liquid and get it on a boat, it becomes worth much, much more. And so it's that factory on the coast, which is all powered by hydroelectricity from BC Hydro. That's really what is adding value. It doesn't create a lot of jobs. We're talking about like maybe 50 or 100 permanent jobs in BC. And it doesn't leave any profits in BC. All of those would go to the Wall Street billionaires, but it would, it would be a facility that would pay rent to the Nisga'a Nation. And so that's why the Nisga'a Treaty Government has supported the project. But it's inaccurate to say that it's Indigenous owned.
Mm-hmm. And we should also say that this is the second iteration of this LNG terminal. It was first proposed by Petronas, right, in 2014, 2015. And it's been resisted by Indigenous communities, both at the location of the terminal, which was previously slated for Aleulu Island, and all along the PRGT pipeline route, which again is a decade-old project. So can you speak a little, this is a question from Teresa, how can we support those First Nations that are resisting SLISMs and PRGT?
Yeah, there's some incredible groups that are doing community organizing on the ground. I would point to the Lachiep Firekeepers in Gixan territory. We can drop their link in the chat. There's also the Flying Frogs, the Kaneda clan out of Gitniao, who are next door, and they've created a Indigenous protected area that covers like 50 kilometers of the pipeline route. The Gitniao hereditary chiefs have also been in court, and they actually have a title claim for their whole territory, which includes a big chunk of the PRGT pipeline. There's folks in Nisga'a territory, there's folks in Tsimshian territory. You know, if you follow our newsletter, we're often sharing stories around these acts of resistance, the lawsuits, as well as links to the groups involved. I think really, like, one of the biggest things that's missing in a lot of these communities is just information about the project and the structure of these deals and who the backers are. And so, yeah, I think anything that can help to get the word out among the BC population at large, or in the media here in BC around like the true ownership and where the money's coming from on these projects, I think is super helpful, because yeah, these are super risky deals that that small communities are being locked into, and all of these discussions are happening right now, so it's really good timing. Yeah, I think the other major thing that we can do just as Canadians is to talk to our ministers, our MPs, our politicians, because without that government backing, none of this stuff works. And so really making the point that these are dollars that could be put into projects that would actually create jobs in Canada, that would help us get off of fossil fuels, that would help to create housing and build transit. There's so many options for what we could spend that money on, and really giving it to these American billionaires is a pretty shameful failure of political imagination.
Yeah, it seems like elected officials often have a very narrow view of how to like plug budget deficits. Essentially, it's like, oh, it must be LNG, it must be export, it must be raw resources to the world. But there are other ways that we can get public tax revenue. And Susan asked this question: why is a wealth tax not even on the government agenda?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the short answer is really we're in this race to the bottom, competing for global capital. And by global capital, we mean these sickos, right? Like our Premier David Eby said, regardless of their political affiliation, these guys can invest anywhere, and we welcome you. And that red carpet for whoever, sovereign wealth funds from the Gulf, American billionaires, foreign state-owned oil companies like the ones that own the LNG Canada terminal. It's really a case of like vultures like circling the world, deciding what carcass to land on, and we're like, oh, pick our bones. It's like that's the game right now. All of these governments are in deficit. They're all just like begging for any foreign capital to come in and back these resource extraction projects. And so they're not going to charge a wealth tax on these guys, right? They're not going to do anything that would deter that foreign investment. And I think until we can actually, invest in ourselves as Canadians and as First Nations communities, and like build the jobs and the projects that we want that are going to benefit our communities with our public money, we're just going to be easy pickings for these global billionaires.
Mm-hmm.
So we're about half an hour in here. I think we should give some folks some resources on how we can really crank up that pressure, and stop our government from giving our precious tax dollars to these warmongering Epstein freaks. Really, I don't know. I can't think of a worse use of public money. So we're gonna crank up the heat this month along with our allies.
Mm-hmm.
You want to talk about some of the details?
Yeah, so the No Billions for Ksi Lisims is a month-long, mainly digital campaign where we're going to crank up the pressure on Carney and some of his key ministers who are going to be in charge of this decision. So we have Gregor Robertson, the housing and infrastructure minister. He was the former mayor of Vancouver and actually co-founder of Happy Planet Juice. So the perfect guy to be in charge of massive.
Planet.
Yeah.
Sad planet.
Perfect guy to be in charge of handing out billions of dollars in subsidies to an LNG company, but he is one of those key ministers. And then we also have the finance minister, François-Philippe Champagne. These are the guys that would be signing off on those multi-billion-dollar loans and loan guarantees. And those are key to financing this American-owned LNG. As Kai said, these projects really can't advance to their final investment decision without those billions of dollars in public money. So we've launched a series of concrete actions targeting these ministers. If you want to take part in these actions, please join our Digital Action Squad. The link is in the YouTube description, and Kai will also drop it in the chat. And once you fill out that form, you'll receive a link to join a WhatsApp community. And that's where you'll be receiving weekly missions with digital actions and insider campaign updates. And these digital actions will culminate in a week of in-person action from April 13th to 17th across the country. That will also be targeting these same key decision makers. There's some good
comments and questions.
Some stuff happening in the live chat. Let's see.
Yeah, we talked about doing like half an hour, but I'm happy to stick around for a few more minutes and answer some questions.
For sure.
Quite the swamp, says Graham. Indeed, it is quite a swamp. Okay, so I've dropped in the link to the Action Squad sign up, that WhatsApp community. Mm-hmm. It's super straightforward. Just pop that link in or copy paste. We're also going to send it out by email when we send out the recording for this video. So it'll be easy to find in your inbox. Okay, question from Louis. Is the TMX pipeline operating at maximum capacity? It wasn't a few weeks ago. I would assume that in the current conditions, with prices going up, that it will be. And the Canadian government is talking about spending a bunch of money to expand that. The first phase of that is mixing in what they call drag reducing agents into the oil in order to be able to push more of it through the same pipe. But they're also talking about dredging the Burrard Inlet, which is just a really sad and terrible idea environmentally for many reasons. But the Tsleil-Waututh Nation has been restoring clam beds and their traditional foods in the Burrard Inlet for generations now. Because of the industrial pollution, it's just taken decades to get back to a point where people could safely eat that shellfish. And of course, dredging up the bottom of that industrial waterway, I think, is going to have a really poisonous effect on all of those foods. And so that's why you see Tsleil-Waututh spiritual leader Reuben George holding ceremony for the inlet. The whole idea is to be able to load those Aframax tankers with a little bit more oil, so they would sit lower in the water and they'd still be able to get under the Second Narrows Bridge. So that's part of the government's plan. And then, of course, Danielle Smith, as you mentioned, super excited about this new pipeline that they plan to build to the West Coast. We'll keep you posted on that as we learn about it.
This is a good one. Would the proposed DRIPA amendment threaten the First Nations' ability to flex their land ownership to get in the way of the project development?
I mean, the short answer is, I think yes. I think that is the intention of the BC NDP government. So right now, if you've been following the news, there's all of this furor over these court cases, one in Richmond with the Cowichan tribes and one in Kakatla territory over the mining laws, the 1800s mining laws that BC still has in place. The upshot is that the BC NDP is using this public anxiety as political cover to amend the law that we have recognizing Indigenous rights. And the goal, I believe, is to try to cut off access, try to prevent First Nations from going to the courts when their rights are violated. I don't know if that'll work, and I think that in and of itself could invite a very interesting legal challenge, but that is the goal, I believe, is to try to reduce the ability of First Nations to litigate on matters that affect their rights and their territory, in order to, again, create more of that certainty, that investor confidence, for foreign investors to come in and put capital into major resource extraction projects. So yeah, I think the DRIPA amendments, that's a great flag, are really worth keeping an eye on, and we should see pretty soon from David Eby what exactly he's planning to change in that bill. 6 years ago, the entire legislature, including all the Conservatives, voted unanimously to recognize Indigenous rights. Times have changed very, very quickly, and it's the BC NDP that are now trying to roll that back and create obstacles, I think, to First Nations seeking justice in the courts. LNG in the USA is actually fracked gas. Carol points out, is that the same elsewhere? 100%. Yeah. More than 90% of the gas that we're talking about in British Columbia is extracted through fracking. It is methane. This is all the same thing. So the natural gas that you're burning in your stove or your furnace at home from Fortis, that's the same thing, fracked methane gas, fossil gas. And that's the same gas that would be pushed through the pipelines to the coast, to gas terminals, to load on boats. And that actually creates an important dynamic that we should mention, which is that because domestic customers are competing for the same supply of gas as these foreign-owned terminals, which have access to these international markets, it drives the prices up. And so this is what happened in Australia when they built out a big LNG export industry, is that people's gas bills tripled, not just residential users, but like warehouses, farms, greenhouses, factories, public buildings. Anyone that heats water or space with gas saw their energy prices go way, way up. And so not only are we giving public money to foreign billionaires to build these gas terminals to try to control the world, energy supply, but also we're going to drive up utility bills here in BC. That's another reason why it's just a totally crazy plan, and we should resist it.
We're not going to. It actually already happened. Like last January, Fortis bills went up.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. They're already jacking up bills in order to pay for these new pipelines, including export pipelines. And then as, global prices sort of level out the market in BC and lift those domestic prices, people can expect to pay even more and more on their hydro bills because, like I mentioned, it's all BC hydro electricity that would be feeding these terminals with discount electricity, and that takes juice out of our grid provincially, and it drives up prices because we have to pay for the infrastructure. So just a bonkers idea on multiple fronts.
Yeah. And there already are federal subsidies for that North Coast transmission line that would feed that hydropower to Ksi Lisims. There's already been, I think, over $170 million earmarked from the feds for that. So that's great.
Carol says we fought and defeated a total of 4 LNG projects in the estuary of the Columbia River. That's near Astoria, between Washington and Oregon. Awesome. That was 2004 to 2016, Carol points out. And that was that previous market cycle that Molly talked about. So the last time there's this big boom in interest, high demand for gas, not a lot of new terminals. And that was when the US and Canada lifted their restrictions on gas exports. And you saw that first big wave of terminal build out. And so, these things go in cycles. This war is, the war is not going to last forever. The price hike is not going to last forever. And this sort of bullish cycle in the market is not going to last forever. If we can outlast them, and I don't know if that's months or years, a lot of these terminals will collapse, just like they did 10 years ago. And this time, there's renewable energy that's waiting to fill in those gaps and to prevent that return of US control over that global fuel supply.
Someone said we need concrete alternatives costed to lend more weight to our arguments. But that was kind of what you were pointing to just now. Like, those alternatives are out there and exist. Like, for the first time ever in 2025, I believe half of the world's electricity came from renewables or something crazy.
The new supply, new supply is now majority renewables. And it is having a huge impact in countries like Pakistan, where they're just uncoupling from this US controlled LNG trade and really going their own way and creating a lot of stability for domestic consumers. It's been a buffer. It's honestly a big part of the reason why the price hasn't spiked more in the current war. Like 2022 with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, if you remember, like, prices at the pump went crazy and gas prices around the world really shot up. And I think a lot of that is now being moderated by some of the demand that's been reduced in the last 4 years.
Here's a good one from Teresa. Do the people of Canada actually gain anything from these LNG industries, i.e. is my standard of living improved in any way?
I think it really depends where you are in the pecking order, right? Like, if you're just paying your bills, we're talking about increased prices for gas and hydro. So that is going to be passed on to customers all the way through the value chain, like food, rent, like everything that we pay for that relies on energy will become more expensive. If you are a Epstein-loving Wall Street freak, then you're going to do very well. I think most of us fall into the first category. And so, unless you are, really in a position to benefit from either like construction contracts on these specific projects, by and large, I think our quality of life will get worse. And that's one other point to mention, which is that the PRGT pipeline, which all of our politicians are so excited about, would be built by Bechtel, which is an American military contractor, massive civic works company in the States. So even the pipeline construction jobs, you can get a job as a laborer, a driver. There will be local jobs, temporary jobs, but the real money and the sort of the white hard hats, the like upper echelons on those job sites are all going to be American.
We should add Brendan Bechtel to this board. He also got massive tax breaks during Trump 1.
Yeah, we would have to adjust the map a little bit. That man has a large head. There's nothing wrong with it. I have a large head, but it's just very round. I see Fortis' misinformation ads all over the place. Can this be countered? Yeah, there's been some really great efforts by the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, the doctors and Kane too, the nurses, to fight back against this greenwashing and misinformation by fossil fuel companies. That's been really inspiring to see. There have been some complaints at the Competition Bureau, which is sort of like the like federal agency. They're cops, but they're like cops for ads and like I mean, they sometimes kick in doors and like run real investigations and wiretaps and stuff. But yeah, you can complain to the Competition Bureau about false advertising. So that's been used by a couple of groups. Yeah, in short, like we still have truth in advertising laws, and if you can prove that they're like totally misleading the public, you can get those ads taken down. But you know, it's a lot of effort to try to chase down all these misleading ads. What's the general strategy to get the key aspects of this info to the public so they can see how it impacts their cost of living? That's a good question from Graham. Yeah, I mean, what we've seen from our mainstream media has been pretty disappointing in terms of like explaining how this impacts regular people. But we have seen them start to cover the US ownership, which is helpful, I think. Like a massive majority of Canadians are opposed to more US control of our natural resources, more US ownership of infrastructure, and especially when it comes with these guys. I think once people find out about these projects and the ownership, they oppose them like 2-1, even in Alberta, from some of the polling we've done. So really the battle is to give people that information. And I think the most trusted source of information is your friends and family, right? It's like people who you already trust. And so having those conversations, you know, informing yourself, but then having those conversations with real people, ideally offline in your real life, that's how we create these larger sort of sea changes, especially when our attention span is so fragmented and everybody, you know, like we're all just looking at our phones trying to figure out whose agenda is being served and what do we believe. I think it's much easier to have those conversations in the real world. And so it's slow. You know, it might mean having conversations one-on-one, but I think it's way more effective than, just blasting stuff out on social media. Yeah. That said, we will be doing more videos, more ads, more blogs, everything we can. And our allies too, all across Canada, are going to be, talking about these projects and putting pressure on those federal ministers right across the country. Yeah. All right. I think we should probably
wrap it up.
Wrap her up. Yeah, this was fun though. This was a good little first experiment. We are not streamers, as you can tell, but we could get better at this. I don't know. If you have feedback, if there's stuff that we didn't get to, if there's like technical issues, go ahead and send us email or pop it in the chat. We will send out a recording of this tomorrow, probably, but with some links to that WhatsApp community so you can join and get the alerts about actions every week. Later in April, in-person actions coming soon to a minister's office, maybe, or another place near you. There will be lots of opportunities to get involved, lots of content to share and stuff to read and check out. And we'll probably do more of these streams. I think we're talking about doing one, every couple of months just to get people caught up and take these questions live. So thanks so much for tuning in. This was a grand experiment, but send us your feedback and we'll try not to screw up the link next time. That was
now we know that starting your stream on private mode means you actually start your stream. It's not a test.
Yeah.
So
that was rough. Oh, Hazel is online, says, pick our bones, senpai.
I think that's in reference to the vultures.
Right. Yeah. Not a question. Teresa says, I will be calling you. Okay.
All
looking
caps.
Forward to it. Cool. Okay. We'll wrap it up for now and let you get on with your day, but thanks so much for tuning in.
Thanks, guys.